Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Diabetes at a Turning Point, Industry, Research, and Opportunity. My name is Dr. Stefan Scherer. I'm part of the Trade and Investment team at Edmonton Global, the economic development agency for the Edmonton metropolitan region in Alberta, Canada. We are broadcasting today's webinar from the Alberta Diabetes Institute at the campus of the university. But first, I would like to start by respectfully acknowledging that we are located on Treaty 6 territory and that we respect the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and the First People of Canada whose presence continue to enrich our vibrant community. Before we begin, I would like to thank Canada's Trade Commissioner Services and the staff at the Canadian embassies around the world for their help and support in promoting this webinar. In particular, I would like to thank Jakob Schmidt at the Canadian Embassy in Copenhagen and Christian Ekström at the Canadian Embassy in Stockholm, who are our partners in today's webinar. Please be assured that we are following and adhering to proper protocol of physical distancing during this webinar. As a point of housekeeping, you can submit any question you may have through the chat function, and we will do our best to get to them in the Q&A session, which will take place near the end of the webinar. If we don't get to your question, we will follow up with you by email in the coming days. Thank you to those who submitted questions with their registration. They have been extremely helpful in guiding the content for this event to make it most beneficial for all attending. November marks the World Diabetes Month, and many of you may know that Edmonton has a long history of contributing on a global stage to diabetes research. Scientists from the University of Alberta played a major role in the discovery of insulin nearly 100 years ago. 20 years ago, we saw the establishment of the Edmonton Protocol, a major advancement in the treatment of type 1 diabetes led by Dr. James Shapiro, Craig Korbutt, and others on the team. We are going to catch up with Dr. Shapiro and Dr. Korbutt in a little while to hear their view of the work that has continued since this major milestone. We will hear their views of what's next as we move towards the goal of solving the global challenge of diabetes. The Alberta Diabetes Institute, also known as ADI, has continued as a role as an industry leader with diabetes research that spans the spectrum from discovery at the molecular level up to clinical and population-based research. The team here has built successful industry partnerships with companies like Novonergas, one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies working in the area of diabetes research and treatment. We will hear from them later. But first, I would like to start by introducing one of our co-hosts, Dr. Peter Light. Peter is the director of the Alberta Diabetes Institute, which is located in the Li Ka-shing building on the campus of the university. Peter and his colleagues are going to share with us research and infrastructure and what's coming next. Welcome, Peter.
Good morning.
Can you set a stage for us and talk about the global challenge around diabetes and how it relates to what's going on here?
Absolutely. I mean, that's a really important question. Globally, there's over 400 million people with diabetes. There's another 350 million people worldwide who are at increased risk of diabetes, and those numbers are increasing. So obviously, something's got to be done about that. So the most important thing for us is that we've established this institute to try and directly address this pressing global concern.
Peter, you and your team have been very instrumental to make this webinar happening this morning. Thank you so much for all the help you have provided with that. Can you give us also a little bit now an insight on what is a mandate of the ADI and how it plays with the university in this diabetes research?
Yeah, I mean, quite simply, the mandate of the ADI is to improve the lives of people living with diabetes, both in terms of prevention, treatment, and ultimately cure. So we have a number of resources here and expertise which we are now employing towards that mandate.
So can you tell us a little bit more about the range and the various streams of research which are going on at ADI?
Of course, and I'll premise that with a bit of historical context here. 20 years ago, we got internationally recognized for the development of the Edmonton protocol for islet transplantation, and we've been building on that. But at that time, we decided that we should actually build a bricks and mortar institute in which we could address all aspects of diabetes, not just islet transplantation, but also discovery research in terms of complications of diabetes, clinical research, healthcare delivery, and also population-based research, all under the same roof. And I believe that we are achieving that goal right now.
That sounds really interesting. Now let's switch to some of the specific research that's happening at ADI. We have people joining us from Denmark today, and Dr. Pat MacDonald has a strong connection to the Danish Diabetes Academy. We are reaching Pat live from his lab upstairs. Pat, can you share with us some information about the focus of diabetes research you are doing?
Sure. My group runs two interconnected research programs. On the one hand, we study the cell biology and the cell physiology of pancreatic hormone secretion, so insulin and glucagon secretion. And in the other portion of our research program, we run a human tissue biobank, which is focused on the isolation and distribution of human pancreatic islets for research, and we send tissue to academic and industry partners around the world.
That sounds like two different complementary streams of research. What is the anticipated impact of that work you and your team are doing?
Well, what we're really trying to do is understand how insulin secretion and glucagon secretion are disrupted in different forms of diabetes, type 2 and type 1. And we look for molecular pathways that may underlie these changes in insulin production.
So most of your work really focuses on what's happening on a cellular level for patients with diabetes. Is that correct?
In thinking about understanding diabetes and how we may approach the disease, where we really fit in is in understanding the cellular machinery and the changes that happen to the pancreas in the disease, and then thinking as well about how we may either address that or reverse it or prevent it in the first place.
Can you tell us what makes you and your group a leader in the world in this research area?
Well, I think one of the things that make my group a leader in understanding pancreatic islet biology is the novel approach that we take to combining the human cell biology with some of the electrophysiologic and genomic and genetic techniques that we use.
So why would someone come to Edmonton to work with your group? What are reasons?
You know, I think one of the reasons people might want to come here to work with us, particularly if they're looking to work in human pancreatic tissue, is that the program we run is a research-specific program, which allows us to adapt to collaborator needs, collect tissue in specific ways, and you may not be able to find that in clinical programs that are run in many other places.
And what particular excites you about the work you're doing?
Well, I mean, the most exciting parts, I think, are making new discoveries. Particularly the way we work with a lot of human tissue, so many of the things that we're working on and discovering are much closer to a human impact when we're studying human tissue biobanking and the cell physiology associated with that.
Can you give us an idea of some of the industry and research partnerships your team has already been part of?
We collaborate with a lot of groups around the world. We have many academic collaborations. We send islets and tissue to something like 120 different laboratories around the world. We are working with some industry partners, and we're pushing projects that impact our understanding of pancreas regeneration, transplantation, human genetics, and metabolism. And that's the stuff that's really exciting. Working with these groups is also very, very rewarding.
As I understand, you have developed some fairly strong partnerships with Denmark already. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I'm very excited to to develop interactions and collaborations within Scandinavia and within Denmark in particular. I'm very fortunate to have recently been awarded a visiting professorship from the Danish Diabetes Academy, and so it's very much in my interest to be trying to form new collaborations in that area.
That's really great, Pat. Industry research and partnerships are really critical to addressing the global challenge. Before we leave you, I'm wondering if you would like to comment on some of the things that makes ADI unique and what gives it a distinct advantage over other research centers.
Yeah, one of the really novel aspects of the Alberta Diabetes Institute is that it houses researchers that really go from, population aspects of diabetes and societal aspects of diabetes, all the way down to clinical work and to human tissues and human cells and molecules. So really, the investigators at the ADI can have a very broad impact in that respect. And where we fit in is really more on the small side of things, where we're looking at the cell biology of the disease.
Thank you, Pat. We really appreciate you taking time and share a bit what you are doing this morning with us. Peter, I know that Greg Korbutt is waiting for us to share some information about one of the labs here in the Alberta Diabetes Institute. He's working at the Alberta Cell Therapy Manufacturing Unit. Can you tell us a little bit about the type of work coming out of this lab?
Yeah, absolutely, Stefan. So the ACTM, or the Alberta Cell Therapy Manufacturing Facility, is on the 7th floor of this building. It's over $25 million, I believe, in terms of investment from the provincial and federal governments. It's a state-of-the-art GMP facility for the development and the processing and manufacture of human-grade tissues, devices and cellular therapies for not just diabetes but other diseases as well. So it really is, I think, the only one in Western Canada, one of the few in North America, and it's open for business, and we have a number of investigators as well as commercial interest in using that facility right now.
Thanks, Peter. That's really a very unique facility which we have available here. And we want to have a look at it and go and talk to Greg in the ACTM. Greg, can you tell us a little bit what the focus of your research is?
My main focus of my research is coming up with a larger supply of insulin-producing tissue, because right now in the clinical islet program, they get the insulin-producing islets from human organ donors. So my research is looking at pigs as a potential source of insulin-producing cells that we can transplant into patients. So my group developed a protocol in 1996 where we were able to successfully isolate islets from neonatal pigs. And we've corrected diabetes in mice, in pigs, and in monkeys as well. So now we're pushing forward to get this approved by Health Canada so that we can transplant more patients.
Aside from getting approval from Health Canada, are there any other challenges to the work you're doing?
The other obstacle with islet transplantation is the patients have to be under immunosuppression, which could be toxic and cause adverse effects. So myself with Dr. Andrew Pepper, we're working on methods to create a localized immune protected environment around the islet so we don't have to use whole body or systemic immunosuppression. So this would alleviate the potential toxic effects of the immunosuppression.
That's truly interesting. I know that you were part of the team that developed the Edmonton protocol, and there you were using human islets. I imagine using islets from pigs as well as addressing the issue with immunosuppression will make the protocol a lot more accessible to patients with diabetes. Can you describe what's unique about the work that's being done in your lab?
Well, my lab developed the protocol for isolating insulin-producing cells from neonatal pigs. We are known internationally as the group that developed this protocol, and I've collaborated with numerous people throughout the world, some in Europe, Australia, and many in the US, where we send these neonatal pig insulin-producing islets to these people for collaborations. So I think that we are known as probably the #1 lab internationally who are working with these neonatal pig islets. The other advantage that my group has is I'm scientific director of the Alberta Cell Therapy Manufacturing Facility, which I'm standing in right now. This is a facility that will allow us, if we need to, or if we can, generate clinical grade neonatal porcine islets that go into the patient. So we have the source and the infrastructure to bring these islets into the clinic to treat type 1 diabetic patients.
That's really great, and would probably be very attractive to industry looking to partner with research being done here. Can you speak a bit more about the industry or research collaborations you have been involved in?
So my lab has collaborated with many researchers internationally. I have sent neonatal pig islets to researchers in Sydney, Australia, in Birmingham, Alabama, as well as some industrial company, biotech companies, for example, Vertex, also known as SEMA. I've been sending them these pig islets and they're testing them in their diabetic pig model. I've also been collaborating with a company called eGenesis in the Cambridge area near Boston. And they're famous for genetically modifying pigs that will be able to use these tissues for transplantations in patients that won't be rejected. So my group has branched out to many industry and collaborators internationally.
Thanks, Greg. There's a lot of interesting stuff happening in your world and with organizations around the globe. Peter, it sounds there's already a lot happening with international collaborations. Can you tell a little bit about the capacity and the appetite which could be done with ADI here?
Absolutely. So one of the ADI's mandates is to establish international collaborations. To date, I believe we have over 330 international collaborations with our investigators. We are aiming to build on that. Diabetes research in itself is very technical. We don't have all of the expertise, but we have some very unique expertise here that we would like to share with collaborators internationally. The other aspect as well is training of students. So we've established a multi-million euro initiative with the Helmholtz Association in Germany for training of international students. So absolutely, we are welcoming opportunities for further international collaborations.
Thank you, Peter, for that. Also pointing out the training and the education part in the mandate ADI has.
Thank you.
Now Dr. James Shapiro is joining us from home. He's limiting his social interactions due to the nature of his work and everything that's going on with COVID. James actually has a home studio, so he will be joining us from there. James, thanks so much for joining.
Thank you, Stefan.
James, you are a leading expert in the field of diabetes research. Can you give us a brief background of how you have been involved in addressing the challenge of diabetes over time?
Well, I was the lead author on the New England Journal paper, and I led the clinical team with the Edmonton protocol 20 years ago. And that was the first time that patients with type 1 diabetes were able to discontinue taking insulin injections. The first 7 patients were all able to come off insulin after their treatment. And we've been able to expand that approach now to running the largest clinical islet cell transplant program in the world.
Can you expand a bit more on the global challenge of diabetes and how the work at the Alberta Diabetes Institute is strategically positioned to discover a cure to diabetes?
So we've been working in the area of cell transplantation for diabetes for the last 20 years or so with the Edmonton protocol, putting cells from organ donors into the liver of patients with type 1 diabetes. And we see that as just the start, really as a proof of concept that cell transplantation can indeed be a future cure for this disease. So what we're trying to do now is to generate stem cells that replace the need for organ donors, because if you look across the world, there are 450 million people with this disease. It costs $1.3 trillion to treat diabetes and all its complications globally every year, and healthcare systems just can't afford that. So we need a better way to treat diabetes and potentially cure it. So we really believe, based on our experience with the Edmonton protocol, that stem cell transplantation can do that. There are 2 different kinds of stem cells. One are called embryonic stem cells, and the other are called iPS cells. And the iPS cells, I think, are probably in the end more exciting and more interesting because those cells are made from the blood. You take a blood sample from a patient with type 1 or type 2 diabetes, this also works for type 2 diabetes, and by a process what initially seems like alchemy, but it's not alchemy, it's basically complex science built on the contributions of a Nobel laureate, Shinya Yamanaka, who discovered in 2007 the process for being able to turn adult cells back into their sort of more malleable stage, and then you can move them forward in time to make them into the cells that you want. So these processes now, these recipes, if you will, like following a recipe in the kitchen. I mean, it's a bit more involved than that. It requires a lot of addition of growth factors and a lot of manipulation in the lab, but you can basically turn an adult cell back in time so that it can be changed and malleable like it was originally in an embryo, and then it takes 27 days from there to turn it into an insulin-making islet type cell. And the ultimate goal for us is to be able to manufacture patients' own cells from their own blood and transplant them back. And if we can do that, that would be a potential cure for diabetes, because patients won't reject their own cells. They won't have to take the anti-rejection drugs like the Edmonton protocol patients have to today.
So what's unique about the work happening at ADI there?
We've got an outstanding track record and a complete focus in taking bench-type research to directly help patients in the clinic. I don't think there's any other place in the world that is so directly focused and able to do that. I mean, for example, we had an experimental protocol that we were testing in mice, and it took us less than a year to take that from a trial in mice with an anti-aging glycopeptide, a special potent molecule that seems to help islet cell survival and function, to a first-in-human clinical trial. We carried out the first-in-human clinical trials with human embryonic stem cell-derived islet-like cells with ViaCyte in 2014, and we've continued those trials. We're right at the forefront in this area.
It sounds like the capabilities and tools that the ADI has in its roster is globally unique and represents what could be a distinct advantage to industry partners. So I'm wondering, with ADI being at the forefront of the fight against the disease, how close are we getting to a solution that would essentially cure diabetes?
Closer than I thought we would be a few months ago. So what we've been able to do now is follow recipes that other people have developed and established, and they work well in our hands. We can now routinely cure diabetes in mice, immunodeficient mice, that now make human insulin, and we make them diabetic. Then we give them these cells that are made from patients' blood with type 1 diabetes. We transplant those cells, and we can transplant them at different stages of development. And the more mature cells obviously function earlier, and the less mature cells take 2 or 3 months to turn into insulin-producing cells. But we can do that fairly routinely in a handful of mice. Now, our goal from here is to turn that into a scale-up process so that we can treat the first 10 or 12 patients in Edmonton with that kind of approach. We already have an ultra clean room facility on the top floor of the Alberta Diabetes Institute that Dr. Greg Korbutt runs, and we're hoping that as we move these processes forward that we can establish them with Health Canada and develop them in a much larger scale so that we can treat the first handful of patients. And from there we're trying to get our head around how do we treat 450 million people with this kind of approach, because it's very labor intensive, very hands-on at the present time.
That does sound like a complex problem to figure out. Now, as you know, one of the regional strengths we have here in Edmonton is our strengths in artificial intelligence. In fact, the University of Alberta is ranked in the top 3 globally in AI research. Do you see potential to capitalize on these strengths to address the scale problems that you are talking about?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The strength in artificial intelligence is immense, both in industry within Alberta and actually at the University of Alberta itself, plus international experts. So we've linked with all the leaders in that area, and they're very committed to helping us turn a process now which is very labor intensive, hands-on, into being an automated process so that we can learn iteratively as we move forward.
Can you give us an idea of some of the things happening in your work in terms of industry partnerships that you are finding the most promising right now?
Well, we have a number of industrial partners. I mean, for example, we're working with a stem cell company, ViaCyte in San Diego, that have been shipping us the human embryonic stem cells that make insulin for the last 7 or 8 years now. We did the first transplants in 2014. I just summarized the results last week, at an international meeting in Vancouver, virtually, showing the progress that we've made. And for the very first time now, we can measure the function of these cells with insulin production in the bloodstream by a test called C-peptide. This was never possible before. And we can show that by sampling these cells over time, they make insulin and they look just like islets.
That's truly incredible. So this webinar we have called Diabetes at a Turning Point, Industry, Research and Opportunity. And so I'm wondering, what excites you about what comes next?
Well, I never look back. I always look forward, and I'm not afraid of challenges. And I am so excited about the possibility of being able to make patients' own cells that make insulin that won't be rejected. I mean, that would be incredible. We deal with transplantation all the time. I'm a transplant surgeon. We have to give patients, most of our patients, very powerful anti-rejection drugs to stop them from rejecting those cells. If we didn't need those drugs, we would be incredibly close to a cure. And that's, is my mission right now, is to turn something that's working routinely in mice to something that will work routinely in patients in the future. I'm certain of that.
That's an exciting status to be in. Are there any other thoughts you would like to leave our audience with?
We've got a pretty solid track record of success, and we've maintained it for a long period of time. And I'm certain with the vision that we collectively have, we will get to the next stage together.
Thank you very much, James. We really appreciate you taking time to chat with us this morning. Now, I would like to introduce our next panelist to join the conversation, Dr. Vincent Rogers. Vince is a Director of Operations here at the Alberta Diabetes Institute and oversees the Clinical Research Unit. Thank you for being with us, Vince, this morning.
It's nice to be here.
Vince, can you give us an overview of the work that's being done out of the Clinical Research Unit at ADI?
So the Clinical Research Unit is a very important part of the mandate of the Alberta Diabetes Institute. It's the piece that brings discovery research through to patient application. The Clinical Research Unit is comprehensive in the sense that we're not just looking at novel drugs and devices, we're also looking at metabolism and nutrition and body composition type studies. Lots of the studies that we do are industry driven, so they're regulatory, phase 2 and phase 3 primarily, but we're connected with the university hospital where there's a phase 1 clinical research unit that we can collaborate with. The staff can provide complete coordination for studies from start to finish. We're connected to the university, so we collaborate with clinicians from different fields of medicine. And we have a specialized group in the clinical research unit that oversees trials related to metabolism and nutrition and body composition. They're called the Human Nutrition Research Unit, and that's led by Dr. Carla Prado. And there's a separate facility in the building that oversees trials related to physical activity and diabetes.
Vince, and what responses are you getting from your industry partners?
Yeah, well, we've worked with dozens of companies over the past 8 years, and the feedback has been excellent. They've been very happy with the quality of the research that we've done, the results that they've gotten. We've worked with large companies, Novo Nordisk, AstraZeneca, Merck, Novartis, and smaller companies as well. And we're always eager to talk to companies about placing their trials with us. It's an excellent facility and a very experienced staff.
Thank you, Vince. I'm sure we'll have more questions in the discussion section of this webinar for you.
No, I'm looking forward to it.
Dr. Carla Prado leads the Human Nutrition Research Unit here at ADI and is an internationally recognized expert in her field. Let's connect with Carla so she can share some of the research that she's working on. Hi, Carla. Can you give us an overview of the research that you are doing at the Human Nutrition Research Unit?
Well, thanks, Stefan. I am so excited to talk a little bit about the research that we're doing here at the Human Nutrition Research Unit. We really have sophisticated techniques to measure body composition and energy metabolism of people with diabetes. So what that means is that we can precisely estimate how many calories people are burning, where the calories are coming from. And in terms of body composition, we can also measure the different proportions of muscle and fat in the body, and we know that that's very important for people with diabetes. So my research is looking at the prevalence of low muscle mass and also how can we prevent and reverse low muscle mass in people with diabetes.
I imagine being able to accurately measure body composition and metabolism creates a lot of great data into the research of diabetes. How can this information translate into the work to solve diabetes?
So right now, we're working on an interventional study, and what we're looking at is high-protein diet. It's actually a high-protein meal replacement, which is a partnership with a German company that we have, and we are trying to see if people who receive or who consume this supplement, they can actually burn more calories, they can improve their blood glucose levels, and also they can lose weight while maintaining muscle mass. So that's very important for people with diabetes.
Can you speak a bit what's unique about the work that you're doing here?
We truly have the best infrastructure that is available in Canada and one of the top in the world. So we can very precisely measure the things we are measuring in my research program. And it really puts Edmonton on the map for the assessment of body composition and energy metabolism. We have precise techniques, we have a very collegial team, and we work with more than 7 different countries, several different stakeholders in our research program.
Carla, your work is very highly regarded and attracting a lot of attention internationally. Why do you think is that?
Well, because of the infrastructure that we have here at the Alberta Diabetes Institute, we really can conduct very unique studies that a lot of people elsewhere in the world can't. Even in Canada, we are very unique, so that's why we attract partnerships with industry worldwide, and people actually come here to learn from us, to observe from us. We have visitors from all over the world on a monthly basis.
Now, can you speak a bit about collaborations and partnerships? Is there a lot that's happening with your team?
Oh, we love to collaborate with different colleagues. For example, we even started a collaboration with the mathematics department because, again, we have such a unique capacity and unique infrastructure. People from several different faculties want to use our techniques and collaborate with us as well. So I think that this is very attractive, not only for our university and for Alberta Diabetes Institute investigators, but also for researchers from all over the world.
Carla, you have mentioned that the infrastructure that you have here is a major enabler of the research being done. How do all these tools benefit the research that you're doing?
So we have a very sophisticated body composition technique, so we can measure bone, fat, and muscle, and we have a number of different techniques that sometimes work better for a population. For example, we can do research in children with diabetes and also older adults with diabetes, and we really have a specialized technique that can capture body composition across the lifespan.
You really do have a lot of interesting tools at your disposal. Carla is now moving down the hall to the whole body colorimetry unit. I can see that she's there. Carla, can you walk us through how that unit works?
So the whole body colorimetry unit is a very unique technique. It's the only one functioning in Canada, and it allows our research participants to live in here for 24 hours. We also have research studies that go on for 32 hours. They can eat, they can drink, they can watch TV, they can exercise here. So it's truly a very precise method. And we measure how many calories people are burning, where the calories are coming from. So again, it's very precise to an extent that if a research participant stands up from a chair or from the bed, we know exactly how many calories they're burning.
Can you draw a patient's blood while they are in the unit?
Yes, actually one of the features of the unit is that we have iris ports that the participant can put the arm outside, and we can collect blood throughout the day as many times as needed for the research. So we can capture how a specific diet is changing blood biomarkers.
Why is that important?
That's very important because diets and medications and supplements, they change blood glucose levels, they change lipid levels, and we can actually measure that in the unit and compare that with the energy metabolism. So how does changes in the blood correlate or relate with changes in the energy metabolism, or how many calories we're burning?
Are there other places in Canada that can do that?
We're very excited that we are the only functioning unit in Canada that can collect these measurements and have a functioning unit, a whole body colorimetry unit.
That's really exciting from a research perspective, Carla. But why do you think it's also important to industry?
This is important for industry because industry is producing supplements and medications that impact metabolism. And here we can precisely measure and quantify these changes and also correlate that with health and health outcomes.
How often is the space used?
So the unit is used approximately once or twice a week. For sure, we have capacity to increase that. So that's why bring your research studies here. We would love to partner with you.
That's great, Carla. I'm sure there are people who will be taking you up on that offer. Thank you so much, Carla.
Thank you so much.
Let's have a look at another aspect in diabetes prevention, in particular as it relates to access of data. I would like to welcome Rich Joseph, who is the CEO of Health City. Health City is an economic development initiative that catalyzes, accelerates, and connects the health innovation ecosystem in the Edmonton region. They have done a lot of work around synthetic data and finding ways to make the regional resource that exists around health data here available to both research as well as industry. Welcome, Rich. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Pleasure to be here.
Rich, can you give us a brief overview on the project around synthetic data and how it might apply to the work that's been done to address the global challenge of diabetes?
Sure. So synthetic data is a new technique that's been developed that allows the use of data without having to expose personal data. So in this case, you take the aggregate characteristics of the original database, port them over to a new database, and you backfill the rest of the database with fictitious data, which is very replicative of the original database.
So what can the Edmonton region, what role can it play to enrich this data?
So the real opportunity here now is to take the power of the clinical data that we have in the region, the research data that we have in the region, and now tie that to the municipal social indicators of health to really create a robust picture around indications like diabetes.
Can you tell us what is unique about this data set Alberta has to offer here?
For sure. So, in Canada, Alberta and Alberta Health Services has the largest health authority in Canada, representing 4.3 million people. So when I talked about using those other pieces of data together, the ability to use that for this large population is extremely powerful.
The Edmonton region is also home to the University of Alberta, who is ranked third in the world in AI research. That's really a unique advantage.
It is, and this is where the power of synthetic data really comes to play. So the strengths of new data analytic techniques and so forth, we don't have those present in our health system. So what we need to do is bring them in with academic researchers, community researchers, or even industry. Synthetic data enables us to do that in a safe way.
So how could industry or somebody from outside of the region get access to it?
Good question, and we're just getting started. So we've finished our first pilot, which proves out that we can actually replicate and do synthetic data. The next step now is for us to be able to put that into a scenario where we can actually share that data with other users in a safe manner.
Are there any other things about Health City or the synthetic data project our international audience should know about?
Absolutely. I think the power of synthetic data now enables us to start thinking broadly. For example, thinking across provincial borders now and looking at how do we combine those data sets to look at a national picture, for example, around diabetes. That gets really exciting. Now you can take that to the next level and go global with it. From a Health City perspective, the only other thing I'd like to mention is that particularly in Canada, we always think of health as a cost to the system. There is an opportunity for economic growth and development around health as well, and that's really what Health City is focused on.
Thank you very much, Rich.
Thank you.
We really appreciate you taking the time to walk us through that. Synthetic data holds a lot of potential for research and innovation in the life science sector and will certainly generate interest from business wanting to capitalize on this opportunity. Now, we would like to bring in a corporate perspective. Welcome to Adam Marcella, the Director of External Affairs at Novo Nordisk Canada, who is joining us via a video link from Mississauga, Ontario. Good morning, Adam.
Good morning, Stefan. Thank you for having me.
Novo Nordisk is one of the largest pharma companies working in diabetes research and has a long and close relationship with some of the work that's happening here at ADI. Can you share with us how Novonergas views the global challenge of diabetes to start the conversation?
Absolutely. And I think even before we talk about that, Stefan, let's talk a little bit about the Canadian context to that. So you go back 100 years seems like a long time, but it really isn't in the grand scheme of things. 100 years ago, a type 1 diabetes diagnosis was effectively a death sentence. So if you were to talk to 1,000 Canadians from coast to coast, they would routinely list the discovery of insulin as the most significant Canadian innovation and discovery, period. And that's a tremendous accomplishment and a tremendous legacy right here in Canada. Transitioning that to a global context, we're talking about Novo Nordisk as a global leader in diabetes. We are looking with current trajectories by 2045, an astonishing 736 million people around the world could be living with diabetes if current trends continue. Certainly within Novo Nordisk, Canada and globally, we see that as a global pandemic long before COVID-19. Diabetes and obesity is a global pandemic, and it's clearly not sustainable. I think we heard that mentioned earlier. The sustainability of health systems around the world is being challenged by this for a whole host of reasons. So we as a company have been talking about bending the curve for many, many years. And that, of course, in the context of COVID has become part of the vernacular, but certainly bending the curve on diabetes rates is tremendously important. And we can talk more about prevention and some of the other strategies that come into play around that.
Adam, earlier we heard about some promising research on treatment and a possible cure of type 1 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is a very different disease process with significant impact to determinants of health and lifestyle in industrialized economies. Can you share with us your perspective on the built environment, its impact, and on diabetes, and how Novonergas is approaching the challenge of type 2 diabetes?
Sure. And I think, if we're talking about kind of where type 2 diabetes stands today, 2/3 of people with type 2 diabetes live in cities. So it's increasingly becoming a more and more urban disease. As people move to cities around the world, we see diabetes rates go up. The long story short is that where we eat, sleep, work, and play has an impact on our health. So that starts to touch on things like food security, built environment, social inequality, and a society increasingly built around convenience. So there's a whole host of factors that kind of go into why diabetes rates, specifically type 2 diabetes rates, rise in cities. But that was really the starting point for Novo Nordisk launching Cities Changing Diabetes several years ago. This is now operating in 25 cities around the world, and it really focuses on multi-stakeholder interventions. So how do we bring together clinicians, community leaders, policymakers, patients themselves and patient groups with industry and come up with shared solutions to type 2 diabetes, specifically in an urban setting. So if you want to get a sense of the types of solutions, some of the cities involved, Copenhagen, Rome, Mexico City, Johannesburg, also Houston, Texas. And in Houston, I love the example of how they engage their faith-based communities. So they actually went out to local churches and started to leverage the churches as a way to actually deliver high-quality diabetes interventions that are culturally appropriate in the communities themselves. And that's initially was a bit of a mind bender when I first heard that example, because you don't think about a faith community as a place for accessing healthcare. We've actually seen similar projects in Canada that Novo Nordisk has been a part of, for example, with the local Sikh community here in the Peel region, and we've had a fair bit of success there. So we're looking to continue that type of an approach.
From your perspective, what impact does diabetes have in Canada?
I think, we talk about the actual incremental cost of the health system, and there's a number of slightly terrifying statistics that you can look at in terms of the trajectory of growth. But I think fundamentally, the impact there, it doesn't matter which province we're talking to or federal government, there's a recognition that the health costs and strain on Canadian healthcare are significant and unsustainable. And part of the challenge is, at least the way I think about it, is when we start to talk about the time horizon, right? So if I'm diagnosed with type 2 diabetes today, I'm likely looking at many years, if not decades, before I start to see poorly managed type 2 diabetes manifest itself into some long-term significant and poor health outcomes. So all the really bad stuff is kicked down the road many, many years. And so I think as a society in Canada, we need to start shortening that latency and thinking about it in terms of the fact that these significant health outcomes are real. They're a significant cost on the healthcare system, but they only come from poorly managed disease and incidence rates that are moving in the wrong direction.
So where do you see the opportunities to bend the curve on diabetes from Novo Nordisk's perspective?
I think, I would turn to some of the partnerships that we've run around the world and in Canada. So even something as simple as the Novo Nordisk Alberta Diabetes Fund, which we set up a number of years ago, that's done some really, I think, significant work in making healthcare accessible to newcomer communities, accessible in the language that you want to speak. And I think as a society, we need to start getting a little bit more serious about how we approach prevention. Prevention has often been something that kind of gets talked about as an aside, but there is the opportunity to innovate in that area of disease prevention. We look at things like continuous glucose monitors and some of the technology that's been brought to bear on diabetes just in the last decade. And these are unbelievable advances from an innovation perspective. Now, how can that be enabled along with some of the things that Reg was just speaking about as it relates to in a safe way, using that data to make data-informed healthcare decisions around everything from what's going to be best for a patient to what's going to deliver the most value to a healthcare system.
So let's look a little bit broader. Obesity is a much more complex chronic disease than it was previously recognized. How is Novo Nordisk addressing the interplay between the two major chronic diseases, obesity and diabetes?
Yeah, it's an important question. And I think first and foremost, Stefan, those two diseases are intricately linked. So, we know that obesity is one of the major contributors to rates of type 2 diabetes. I think there is some similarity there, and certainly all of our work as a company over 90 plus years has focused largely on diabetes and increasingly in other serious chronic diseases as well. But I think there is some similarity. I would urge any of the viewers today to take a look at the recently published obesity clinical practice guidelines. There's a lot of rich dialogue. It's almost a misnomer to call them clinical practice guidelines. There's a lot more in there around specifically weight stigma and bias as it relates to obesity. That is a commonality with type 2 diabetes. There's a lot of internalizing of blame that people go to in terms of the reason why I might have type 2 diabetes or the reason why I might be suffering from obesity. We now know that these are really complex chronic diseases. There's an interplay of genetics and socioeconomic factors and just ethnicity. There's a lot of stuff that gets layered into why somebody might end up with type 2 diabetes or obesity. And it's absolutely not an issue of people blaming themselves for that. I think as a society, we need to get past that. A big part of that is looking at our underlying attitudes and beliefs. What do we actually believe and think around type 2 diabetes as underlying causes? Are we willing to react with a sense of empathy towards people who are dealing with a challenging struggle, be it obesity or diabetes?
Thank you very much, Adam, for sharing some of these thoughts. Now we would like to ask Peter and Vince to join us as we address some questions that have come from the audience. Let's start with the first question from Gaurav Verma, who is joining us from the Lund University Diabetes Center in Sweden. His question is, there is a huge demand of translational biology nowadays. On a basic scientist, what should we do during our research that could possibly lead us to join industry? Maybe that's a question for Peter to start with.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think obviously translational research is front and center these days. We have cell lines, we have animal models we can use to get really good mechanistic data, but you need to translate those findings into the human situation. You mentioned that it seems as though the person, Gaurav, is a basic scientist. They're basically interested in how they can translate their research into industry. I think best way to do that is see if you can identify sources of human tissue one can use. That would be the first thing I do, whether that's in your own institution or you may have to go outside of your own institution. Industry itself have a number of initiatives which allow them to engage with academic institutions such as universities. So I would look at that opportunity as well.
Okay. Adam, would you have a perspective of that to add as well?
I think, I think Peter handled that well. I think there's probably working with industry is very country specific and very company specific, right? So depending on areas of interest, the starting point is always where are your research interests already and how do you dovetail that with kind of who's out there. And I would also encourage, beyond just kind of the traditional pharma and biopharm larger companies, who are those startups in the virtual care technology space that might have something where there's a good synergy with your research track.
Okay. Let's go to the next question. There were several people in the audience who were wondering how the process works for those who want to participate in trials. Can you talk us through the process? Maybe Vince to start.
Sure. For clinical research, I mean, probably the best way to learn about the clinical trials that we're conducting at the Alberta Diabetes Institute's Clinical Research Unit is to go to our website. It's easy to navigate. There's a great description of all of the trials that we do. It differentiates them between type 1, type 2 gestational, and it's easy to see the eligibility, and naturally people are welcome to contact the clinic directly, but the website's probably the best place. Our own group is also actively recruiting all the time.
Thank you, Vince, for that. And you will be the contact if there is anything to go through that. Another question which came, what is in the works to raise Edmonton's profile as a global leader in diabetes research?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's also, it's timely as well because as of next year, it's the 100th anniversary of discovery of insulin. And although that was initially reported from Frederick Banting's group in Toronto, actually James Colliper, University of Alberta biochemistry professor, was on sabbatical in Toronto, was actually instrumental in purifying the insulin extract used in the first dogs and in the first patients. Mm-hmm. So we actually have a very close link to the discovery of insulin at the University of Alberta. And we are working with the University of Alberta as well as the City of Edmonton to plan a number of events for next year. Obviously, during the COVID pandemic, those are likely to be virtual, but that has the advantages that people can register for that and watch them from anywhere in the world as well.
Adam, I see you have a comment as well.
Yeah, everything that Peter just said, and I would also add to that, when I think about what makes Edmonton a little bit different, certainly I've interacted in all provinces of the country with a number of different cities, and I do think there's something unique about Alberta in terms of its agility and willingness to partner and collaborate. Like we've seen that, I've certainly seen that personally over many, many years. So agility, willingness to partner, willingness to have open conversations, and frankly, something that Reg Joseph was talking about just a few moments ago around better data sets that have better interoperability and maybe a few steps ahead of other regions of the country in terms of being able to derive insights. I think that's important.
So here's another question, Adam, for you. Nordisk has one of the largest foundations in the world. What are the main priorities of the foundation to advance human health?
I would make a slight correction to what you said. We don't have one of the largest foundations in the world. That foundation has us. So the Novonergas Foundation is the majority owner of Novonergas Commercial. And that is a very Scandinavian model. It's a very common model in Denmark. So the Novonergas Foundation owns the majority of the voting shares in Novo Nordisk. And basically that provides a stable platform for our commercial activities. And that foundation has a pretty lofty mission around supporting scientific, humanitarian, and social causes, and then also providing that stable basis for our commercial and research activities. Yeah.
And that fits with Edmonton and Edmonton Global in the region, having also life sciences identified as one of the key areas to work in a synergistic with some of the agri-food and advanced manufacturing, which are the other key areas for the region identified by the shareholders. Let's jump to a next question. Given what we have heard about the complexity of diabetes from the cellular level through the human physiology and the impact of determinants of health, what is the strategy of ADI to support research to span this continuum? I think this question is for
Yeah,
Peter.
I mean, that's a great question, and that was one of the first ones we posed when we initially started the Alberta Diabetes Institute and had those discussions about exactly what we wanted the mandate of the Institute to be. You know, I think the thing that's unique about the ADI is that we have, you know, basic research discovery labs. We have a lot of partnerships with clinician scientists. We have a team of healthcare delivery experts as well as population health experts. And if you're going to make a difference to people living with diabetes, you need to have those groups of people interacting on an almost daily basis, having those discussions to find out where the roadblocks are for moving the research forward, what tissues might be needed. So for example, Pat MacDonald was talking earlier about IsletCore providing human islets. Well, human islets fundamentally operate a lot differently than, say, mouse islets do. We need access to that tissue to understand the human condition. But we also need to be able to partner with our clinical partners in order to translate any findings into humans and then look at those results in the population. And I think if you combine those all together with the fact that we have electronic medical records now in 4 million people in Alberta, so we can access that data, I think we've got a really good span of discovery research all in the pipeline all the way to outcomes established in Alberta. And I think that's what makes us unique, and that is certainly our strategy that we're moving forwards with.
Thanks for sharing that, Peter. Adam, did you have a comment to add on
Yeah,
this?
I would just add that, Diabetes Canada has been doing some great work over the last couple of years advocating for a national diabetes strategy. So they're calling it Diabetes 360. But I think ultimately how that gets operationalized within individual provinces is exactly what Peter was just talking about, right? So those ability to look at large data across a full EMR spectrum as opposed to pockets of data, that's incredibly powerful. And it's a unique advantage within Alberta.
Mm-hmm. So here's another question, I think that goes towards Vince. Can you walk us through briefly how the process works if someone from industry was looking at building a partnership with ADI? What would be their first steps?
Yeah, so I mean, we've got scientists working in a lot of different areas, as you've heard through the webinar. One of the best places to start is me as a contact, a first contact. And one of the other things I've done is I've compiled a list of our lead research and development in terms of tech development, so cell therapies, drug targets, gene therapies. And I've put those in a concise document, who the lead researcher is, the description of the research, and then what stage it's at. And if an industry company or a researcher shows some interest in that, they can contact me. I can link them up with the scientist, get more information for them. And they can go from there in terms of de-risking and sharing the IP development together.
That information will also be available on the website where the webinar, you can find that as well. Time is flying, and we're coming to the last question now, and that's posed to everybody on the panel here. What do each of you see as the biggest opportunity for the economic development in diabetes and obesity in the next 5 years? Peter, do you want to start?
So maybe I'll start with that, and I'm really putting it from an Edmonton or an ADI perspective here. I think it's going to be translation of findings that we have into humans and development of novel therapies. I think James Shapiro is mentioning as well. I really do think cell-based therapies are just around the corner. Greg Korbutt, the ACTM, again, we're looking at developing these therapies in-house in Edmonton to be used not only in Canada but ultimately around the world. So I think that's a really big opportunity there. And again, we mentioned about AI, so artificial intelligence. Working with the team here has been great. I mean, my own lab has been working with them at developing non-invasive glucose monitoring in terms of and building in artificial intelligence to work out what the signals mean. There's a great opportunity here, and I think that's what's going to allow us to develop the economy in terms of diabetes economics in the near future.
Yeah.
And frankly, for me, in the next 5 years, I see our scientists, they've gotten some great discoveries made and developed those through proof of concept. And we really look to industry to partner more and more to help take that to clinical application.
Okay. Adam?
Yeah, I think to that point, basic research and taking basic research and shortening the lag time to application, where it's actually helping in communities and helping Canadian patients, that's a big part of it. I would argue that, yes, the AI piece is clearly emerging and is going to be critical. When I look across the entire country and all provinces, I don't think it's too much to say that even before that, let's talk about digital health and let's actually talk about moving away from fax machines across the entire country, because we need to do that first. But everything that the others said as well.
Thanks you very much for these statements. And that brings us to the end of this webinar. I would like to say thank you specifically to Peter and to Vince here at the ADI for their strong support in putting this event together. Thank you also to the researchers Pat, Greg, James, and Carla for giving us a peek into their labs and to the work they are doing currently. Thanks also to Reg Joseph from Health City and Marcella from Novonergas for joining us today to share your perspectives. We also appreciate the support from the TCS offices, particularly in Copenhagen and Stockholm, for their help in promoting this event. If you are joining us today from these regions, and are looking for more information around these topics, feel free to reach out to the local trade commissioner offices. On your screen, you can see their contact information, and this will also be shared in the following material that will be sent out to all attendees in the coming days. Please keep an eye on your inboxes, as we will be sharing some valuable information, including more details about the Health City Synthetic Data Project, as well as a list of projects, as Vince mentioned here at ADI, that are actively seeking industry partners. I would also like to thank the technical team from Bad Films, who have been working hard in the background to make this webinar possible. A reminder to everyone who submitted questions, if we did not get to them in the roundtable at the end, we will be following up with you by email. Lastly, a big thank you to everyone who took time to participate in this webinar. I trust that you found some information valuable and that you enjoyed hearing about some of the exciting things that are happening in the Edmonton metropolitan region. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us at Edmonton Global by visiting our website at edmontonglobal.ca. Thank you and goodbye.